Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about session 31, and like I said at the end of the last session, this session is going to get a few trigger warnings, especially if you are a queer person. This session can be kind of triggering, so we're going to take it apart. We're going to try to put into context the things that Ra is saying and hopefully remove a little bit of the sting from what Ra says. When you read it out of context, it seems pretty problematic, but I think in context, it makes a lot more sense. So we're going to do that. We're going to try to be careful. I would also solicit and request if there are any people who are queer who are listening to this and want to give any sort of feedback about my comments or how Ra's comments make them feel. I'd be really happy to hear that. If you're a cis het person and you want to share as well your feelings, that's fine. I'm just not soliciting them like I am from other queer people, because obviously queer people are a minority and I haven't heard very many queer people's personal takes on this session. So, full disclosure, for my own personal identity, I would consider myself on the spectrum of queerness. I feel very agender personally. I don't really identify with either gender in a strong way. I obviously know that I have been socialized for almost 40 years as a woman, but there's just a distance between that and who I am and how I feel. I'm also relatively asexual. More precisely, I'm demisexual, which means I don't actually feel sexual attraction in a physical, chemical way until I really, really know somebody and I'm attracted to them on a deeper level. So that will become relevant as we talk about what's going on in this session. So that's why I'm putting that out there on the table. But we're going to go ahead and try to talk about this session and make some sense of it. All right. So I am Ra. I greet you in the love and in the light of the one infinite creator. We communicate now. Questioner. I would like to ask a question first for the instrument herself. She requests to know if it would be advisable for her to walk alone now that she feels better. I am Ra. This is acceptable. So part of Ra's advice for Carla during her illness was to exercise more often because it was going to help build up her physical strength, her physical endurance, and because she is relatively weak and just kind of susceptible to things happening to her, Ra had advised that she have somebody with her while she goes walking and does her exercises. And so here, I'm assuming she just wants to take away that burden from, I'm guessing it was mostly Jim who would walk with her. I think she wanted to free Jim from that burden of having to walk with her, and so she could do her exercises on her own. But eventually she does need Jim to walk with her again in the future when she starts to suffer a bit more intensely from the psychic attacks that happen as the contact progresses forward. Ra does again prescribe Jim or Dawn, but I think it's usually Jim, to walk with her to keep her safe. But at this point in time, she is okay. She's cleared to walk by herself. So, 31.2, questioner. Okay, what I'm going to do is use the information that we did at the end of the previous book that you suggested would be more appropriate for more advanced material. We will put it in the book at this point, as we are talking about bisexual reproduction, and I would like to expand on this material a little bit to get some definitions and better understandings. You speak in this material of sexual energy transfer. Could you define that energy transfer and expand upon its meaning, please? I am Ra. Energy transfer implies the release of potential energies across, shall we say, a potentiated space. The sexual energy transfer occurs due to the polarizations of two mind-body-spirit complexes, each which have some potential difference one to the other. The nature of the transfer of energy, or of the blockage of this energy, is then a function of the interaction of these two potentials. In the case where transfer takes place, You may liken this to a circuit being closed. You may also see this activity as all experiential activities, as the creator experiencing itself. So, a sexual energy transfer is just one specific type of energy transfer. We're all engaging in energy transfers all of the time. There are potentiated differences between two entities, and when you reach out to interact with another being, you are crossing that threshold, and usually there's some kind of exchange of energy, whether it's social or emotional. There's all different kinds of energy transfers that can happen. A sexual energy transfer, obviously, is a very specific kind of energy transfer that contains a lot of power, but all energy transfers can be viewed this way, as a potential to happen in any chakra. And so I have more to say, but I think it'll be relevant as we go on. So we're going to just push forward here and get into more specifics. 31.3, would this then be the primal mechanism for the creator to experience self? I am Ra. This is not a proper term. Perhaps the adjective would be one appropriate way of the creator knowing itself, for in each interaction, no matter what the distortion, the creator is experiencing itself. The bisexual knowing of the creator by itself has the potential for two advantages. Firstly, in the green ray activated being, there is the potential for a direct and simple analog of what you may call joy, the spiritual or metaphysical nature which exists in intelligent energy. This is a great aid to comprehension of a truer nature of beingness. The other potential advantage of bisexual reproductive acts is the possibility of a sacramental understanding or connection, shall we say, with the gateway to intelligent infinity, for with appropriate preparation, work in what you may call magic may be done and experiences of intelligent infinity may be had. The positively oriented individuals concentrating upon this method of reaching intelligent infinity, then, through the seeking or the act of will, are able to direct this infinite intelligence to the work these entities desire to do, whether it be knowledge of service, or ability to heal, or whatever service to others is desired. These are two advantages of this particular method of the creator experiencing itself. As we have said before, the corollary strength of this particular energy transfer is that it opens the door, shall we say, to the individual mind-body-spirit complex's desire to serve in an infinite number of ways and other self, thus polarizing towards the positive. So here, Ra is saying that a sexual energy transfer is one appropriate way of the creator knowing itself. It's not really a primal way of the creator knowing itself, or the primal mechanism is the way that Dawn phrases the question. No, it is one appropriate way of the creator knowing itself. As Ross said before, the bisexual reproductive mechanism creates a magnetic pull between two entities, drawing them together in a situation where they're then able to have many, many opportunities to serve each other. And then if an offspring is created, then there's many, many even more opportunities to serve the offspring. So, but Ross says the other consequences of this mechanism of the creator knowing itself is that a green ray energy transfer is powerful because it invokes a sense of joy within the two beings who are experiencing that green ray energy transfer. And that feeling of joy, of post-coital bliss, is an analog for the spiritual or metaphysical nature which exists in intelligent energy. So Ross says often that that is the creator's natural state of being, is this joyful, natural feeling of love for all of creation. And so a green ray energy transfer helps two beings feel closer to that, closer than you do without that green ray sexual energy transfer. Obviously, there are other ways to feel that kind of joy, but it's one avenue towards feeling that joy. And honestly, green ray energy transfers aren't incredibly common, but they're definitely not impossible to have when you have two people who are together, who are somewhat consciously working through their experiences together and trying to get to that point of unconditional love and acceptance for each other. And then, of course, too, Ross says that when entities are blocked in the orange and yellow rays, and feel an insatiable sexual appetite, subconsciously, that's what they're seeking. They're seeking that green ray connection to the joy that exists within intelligent energy. So that's one function of the energy transfer. And then the other one is the higher level of magic that can occur if you can make it to an indigo ray transfer with your partner. And that honestly, in most cases, takes a significant amount of work. Here, Ra says, through the seeking or the act of will. So it takes intention to do this. And again, as Ra said in the previous session, there is no possibility for indigo ray transfer unless both entities are prepared for that indigo ray experience to wield that magic. It's something that you are doing together. So there's the doubling effect that's going on because there's two entities using their wills in a combined fashion for this effect. So as Ross says, that this seeking and touching upon intelligent infinity through the sexual act creates the ability to direct this infinite intelligence to the work these entities desire to do, whether it be knowledge of service or ability to heal or whatever service to others is desired. So you're pulling this energy through to use in a polarized way. It's not just for general manifestation of events. It's for a specific polarized experience and seeking further polarity. That's the function of the indigo ray sexual energy transfer. So 31.4, Dawn says, can you expand somewhat on the concept that this action not only allows the creator to know itself better, but also creates in our density an offspring or makes available the pathway for another entity to enter the density? I am Ra. As we have previously said, the sexual energy transfers include the red ray transfer, which is random, and which is a function of the second density attempt to grow, to survive, shall we say. This is a proper function of the sexual interaction. The offspring, as you call the incarnated entity, which takes on the mind-body complex opportunity offered by this random act or event called the fertilization of egg by seed, causes an entity to have the opportunity to then enter this density as an incarnate entity. This gives the two who were engaged in this bisexual reproductive energy transfer the potential for great service in this area of the nurturing of the small experienced entity as it gains in experience. It shall be of interest at this point to note that there is always the possibility of using these opportunities to polarize towards the negative, and this has been aided by the gradual building up over many thousands of your years of social complex distortions which create a tendency towards confusion, shall we say, or baffling of the service to others aspect of this energy transfer and subsequent opportunities for service to other selves. So, here's a pretty mechanical biological question. I think Dawn's trying to ask a question and Ra isn't quite grasping the question necessarily, but here Ra is saying that the red ray energy transfer is random as a function of the fertility of the two entities who are engaging in intercourse, and then, it creates an offspring, a mind-body complex that another entity can then move into and begin their life experience in. And then, as we just said, this then creates the opportunity for service within the parents of this offspring. But something I find interesting here, too, is that Ra then, makes a note that these opportunities don't just create the potential for positive polarization, they also create the potential for negative polarization. And I think the way that Ra kind of puts this in here, a lot of people say that Ra doesn't have a bias. Ra isn't polarized. I've had this argument many, many times. I believe that Ra identifies as a service to others, social memory complex, and I think this is one of those clues where they're like, oh yes, these opportunities create service to others, and by the way, they can also create opportunities for service to self. We're just making sure to add that in, though we wouldn't suggest or encourage these opportunities. They're distortions. They involve confusion or baffling of the service to others aspect of this energy transfer because they see so much powerful, positive potential with the sexual energy transfer, because they do say that when they were on Venus, that was one of their primary focuses in the evolution of their group consciousness, was this focus on sexual energy transfers and understanding them. So for Ra, the default is the positive expression of these sexual energy transfers. But then they note that our peoples have baffled the service to others potential within these sexual energy transfers. And obviously, there are service to self potentials. If you have a child, you can make service to self choices in regards to raising that child, or choosing not to raise that child would be a service to self choice, abandoning the child and not being a parent to them. So, like all catalysts, we have a choice. Ra especially sees sexual energy transfers as a vehicle for service to others, polarization, but again, as we're talking about, is noting that there is the negative potentials within these experiences as well. So 31.5, Dawn says, if a sexual energy transfer occurs in green ray, and I am assuming in this case that there is no red ray energy transfer, does this mean it is impossible then for this particular transfer to include fertilization in the birthing of an entity? I am Ra. This is incorrect. There is always the red ray energy transfer due to the nature of the body complex. The random result of this energy transfer will be as it will be, as a function of the possibility of fertilization at a given time in a given pairing of entities. The green ray energy transfer occurs due to the vibratory rate of each entity being undistorted in any vital sense by the yellow or orange ray energies. Thus the gift, shall we say, being freely given, no payment being requested either of the body, of the mind, or of the spirit. The green ray is one of complete universality of love. This is a giving without expectation of return. So again, here Don's trying to figure out something that he's a bit confused about. He's thinking that if there's a green ray transfer, then there isn't a red ray transfer, right? It's a green ray transfer. But Ra's saying that there's always a red ray transfer, and that the green ray transfer is a function of being undistorted enough to have your energy body open and available to have that energy transfer. So I would assume when you have these types of energy transfers, whatever ray is the highest in whatever, even if it's not a sexual energy transfer, in any sort of energy transfer, that there is something going on with every chakra up into the highest one that you can go. So there's some sort of resolving of the potential differences within the lower chakras, because it's very rare for anyone to be just completely unblocked in the orange and yellow rays. And here, even Ross says, undistorted in any vital sense by the yellow or orange ray energies, because it's really difficult to have completely open energy body. There's always going to be something going on there. But here Ra is explaining that yes, the red ray energy transfer always occurs during sex. I would guess, assuming that the partner who bears the seed ejaculates. I think that's probably the prerequisite for there being this red ray energy transfer that could result in offspring, obviously, right? But again, Ra does say it is just a function of the current fertility of both entities, because obviously, the egg-bearing partner, their fertility is on a cycle, so there are certain parts of the month where they aren't fertile at all, so the red ray energy transfer would not result in a child. But if both entities are fertile, then the potential exists. That's just how it is. And I think we know that. It's like Sex Ed 101, right? And then I will just say too, Ra emphasizes that the green ray energy transfer is one without any expectation of return. And I think that applies to not just the sexual energy transfer, it applies to any green ray energy transfer. There has to be a giving of the self without any expectation of any sort of reciprocation from the other self. Just a pure, unconditional love given to that other person. So, 31.6, Dawn says, I was wondering if there was some principle behind the fact that a sexual union does not necessarily lead to fertilization. I'm not interested in the chemical or physical principles of it. I'm interested in whether or not there is some metaphysical principle that leads to the couple having a child or not. Or is it purely random? I am Ra. This is random within certain limits. If an entity has reached the seniority whereby it chooses the basic structure of the life experience, this entity may then choose to incarnate in a physical complex which is not capable of reproduction. Thus, we find some entities which have chosen to be unfertile. Other entities, through free will, make use of various devices to ensure non-fertility. Except for these conditions, the condition is random. So, again, we're saying pretty much the same thing, that it's just a random occurrence based upon the fertility of two entities. I think it's interesting that Rod doesn't emphasize that there's more of a sort of planning of potentially having children. It's really interesting, and it's making me wonder if the offspring has more of a will in deciding who its parents are than a parent has will of deciding who its offspring are. It seems almost like this isn't a pre-incarnatively planned thing for the parent. I don't know, the way Rod describes this with Dawn's question. And Dawn's curious about this because, him and Carla were unconventionally partnered, and Dawn ended up choosing to be celibate, but Carla always wanted kids. Like, she always really, really wanted kids, and eventually she just got her tubes tied when she realized that she was never going to have kids with Dawn, and that Dawn would never accept her having children. She says that, she chose to become sterilized so that she could focus her service on channeling. But, she really wanted to be a parent, and Dawn really, really didn't want to be a parent. So I can see this line of questioning kind of bubbling up from that dynamic between the two of them. Like, what are the metaphysical principles between two entities and whether or not they have an offspring? And here Ross says that it's pretty random whether or not beings have an offspring, which is interesting to me. I have an offspring. He's 5, and 6 years ago, I would have been surprised to know that I was going to be a mother because I didn't think that that was part of my life experience, but it turned out to be so, and I'm grateful for that. But it sort of does lend itself to the randomness of whether or not we have children. All right, so 31.7, Dawn says, "Thank you. In the material earlier, you mentioned magnetic attraction. Can you define and expand upon that term?" I am Ra. We used the term to indicate that in your bisexual natures, there is that which is of polarity. This polarity may be seen to be variable according to the, shall we say, male/female polarization of each entity, be each entity biologically male or female. Thus you may see the magnetism when two entities with the appropriate balance, male-female versus female-male polarity, meeting and thus feeling the attraction which polarized forces will exert one upon the other. This is the strength of the bisexual mechanism. It does not take an act of will to decide to feel attraction for one who is oppositely polarized sexually. It will occur in an inevitable sense, giving the free flow of energy a proper, shall we say, avenue. This avenue may be blocked by some distortion towards a belief/condition which states to the entity that this attraction is not desired. However, the basic mechanism functions as simply as would, shall we say, the magnet to the iron. So I think this is core, this is critical. This is really what the rest of the conversation is revolving around, is this idea of magnetism that is created by polarized body complexes. This is the bisexual reproductive mechanism. It's that two polarized body complexes are going to be drawn together like a magnet. It takes no act of will, Ross says. It's just a totally subconscious thing, biological, biochemical, pheromones, hormones, these things pushing two entities into a situation where a sexual exchange might occur. So it's interesting because I do think here Ra is basically validating the trope that a man and a woman can't be just friends, right? Obviously that's not true, but there's also another layer going on where our bodies are polarized in a way that's deliberate, that's meant to create this sexual attraction between two entities. And obviously, we can do that because Ross says that there are ways that people distort and block that free flow of energy because they have a belief/condition which states to the entity that this attraction is not desired. Let's say you have another partner, you have a partner that you're committed to, and you're with a polarized other self, and you feel this attraction start to bubble up, and you immediately say, oh no, I don't want that because I have a partner and I don't actually want to have sex with this person, I want to have sex with my partner, so you dismiss it. But if you didn't have those beliefs or those limitations preventing you from allowing this magnetic attraction to quote unquote do its job, then it would just automatically happen. And I think it does just automatically happen for a lot of people who don't have these distortions, blockages, because Ra is referring to these, the desire to refrain from having intercourse with absolutely everyone you feel attracted to as a distortion/blockage that is inhibiting you. But I think that's okay. I think it's okay to be in a mated relationship and not have indiscriminate sex. And it's okay to not be in a mated relationship and have indiscriminate sex with everyone. But essentially, if there are two entities who don't have any sort of partner, who feel that magnetic sexual attraction, there are probably going to be other thoughts that prevent them, because we do have like a purity culture that we've been indoctrinated within. Rod does talk about it even with Carla. Carla loved having sex. She loved reading romance novels, but there was still a part of her that felt guilty, that somewhere in her Christian beliefs, she felt like sex was kind of dirty. And so that was inhibiting for her. But if it wasn't inhibiting for her, she would have been much more open sexually and would have probably, I think Rod does imply, like, received more benefits from her sexual experiences. Because again, the other layer too with Carla is that she saw Don as her primary partner, but Don was celibate and she did not want to be celibate. So they had an agreement that when Don was out of town for work, because he was a pilot, that then she would have lovers. And so this, on some level, still kind of bothered her, which I don't think is too surprising. I think it takes a strong person to be able to compartmentalize all of these things and not have any sort of feelings of guilt around them. And then, of course, when Jim moved in with them, Jim was there all the time. And so it felt more like it was in Dawn's face, I would guess, her and Jim's relationship, whereas before she was much more discreet. So there are so many ways that we baffle this potential magnetic attraction between each other, because we really don't need to just be breeding more humans on this planet. That's another distortion, right? That prevents people from just mating indiscriminately. It feels like there's plenty of humans on the planet, and I know that's kind of a myth as well, but viscerally it does feel that way for a lot of people. Like we're not managing the resources on this planet in a sustainable way at this time. So that's one reason why people refrain from, again, procreating all the time. But without these sorts of distortions that prevent it from happening, it would just happen. And I think a lot of people have experienced that kind of magnetic pull between one person and another, where it just happens. And you're just like, oh my gosh, what just happened? And it's because that magnet works so well. But I will go ahead and add in here that this is why I brought up my asexuality, because I don't think I've ever really felt that just pure magnetic, chemical, sexual pull towards another person that wasn't an act of will in some way. You know what I'm saying? I think that's really what asexuality is. There isn't that strong chemical pull between two entities. And, Ross says later on that sixth density wanderers are likely to refrain from programming the bisexual reproductive function and instead seek out partners that they will experience something closer to sexual fusion with. So 6-density wanderers are usually seeking out other 6-density wanderers for sexual partners, but not in this way that this bisexual reproductive mechanism is just pulling random entities together, trying to create this catalyst between them. So I think that's a really important point, because again, we're going to go forward here now in 31.8, and we're going to start talking about what's going on with those who are experiencing homosexuality. So Don says, we have what seems to be an increasing number of entities incarnate here now who have what is called a homosexual orientation in this respect. Could you explain and expand upon that concept? I am Ra. Entities of this condition experience a great deal of distortion due to the fact that they have experienced many incarnations as biological male and as biological female. This would not suggest what you call homosexuality in an active phase were it not for the difficult vibratory conditions of your planetary sphere. There is what you may call great aura infringement among your crowded urban areas in your more populous countries, as you call portions of your planetary surface. Under these conditions, the confusions will occur. So I think really here is the crux of the problematic things that Ra is saying. Entities of this condition, homosexuality, experience a great deal of distortion. Okay, but what Ra is talking about is the distortion of that bisexual reproductive mechanism. Because two entities that are drawn together to have sex and hopefully reproduce are just given so much more catalyst, especially when that potential for offspring is activated in that random way. Now, entities who are homosexual still do experience that magnetic pull based upon their personal balance of male-female / female-male. And, Ra says other times that every female is male, every male is female. These body complexes are on a spectrum of male-female and female-male. So two homosexual people can still be magnetically drawn to each other if they have a potential between the two of what their male-female polarization, internal balance is. And so here Ra is saying that what happens is that beings who spend more time in one body than the other have likely come into this incarnation trying to balance that, but due to the population density in some of our more urban populated areas, this creates an auric infringement upon those beings, which leads to a negation of the bisexual reproductive function, that magnetic pull between two polarized body complexes. And then more, it's like you're being drawn to, again, that polarized, the less physical manifestation of the male-female polarity within somebody. So here what Ra is saying is that if you find yourself as a man attracted to other men, that is likely because most of your incarnations you were a woman. So you felt this biological attraction towards men is very intense and ingrained within your spirit. Not just within your mind and your body, but within your spirit, because it's been carried over through all of your incarnations. So here I'm going to also just shoehorn in a little bit more information that I've read from the Confederation about homosexuality. In particular, I would like to add in, I had read about AIDS, some of the sessions from the late 80s, early to mid 90s, where AIDS was a common question, and what the Confederation had to say in regards to AIDS was that this was a choice, and again, this can be pretty triggering, but I think contextually it makes some sense, that AIDS was a choice among what is essentially the homosexual group mind consciousness that then created the type of catalyst that the bisexual reproductive magnet created in a different way. So that when beings, because especially before AIDS, being homosexual really, for the most part, meant that you couldn't get married, that you wouldn't get married. And maybe you would have a long-term partner, but you'd have to be pretty hush-hush about it. And I think in general, it was just easier to not have a partner and to just, live that lifestyle of having more of a open attitude towards sexual relationships with other people. That this sexual relationship didn't then carry forward the next steps of potentially serving others. However, when people started getting sick, this created a need and a desire to take care of each other and really put into stark contrast our apparent mortality, obviously. So AIDS was a way for the homosexual group mind consciousness to create more avenues for the potential for service to others within their paradigm. And so really, again, before AIDS, homosexuals really didn't get married. Now it's really very normal for homosexuals to get married, but it seems like to the Confederation, this was sort of a necessary step to create the conditions where it opened up those possibilities for more service to others. Because I think in general, whether you're gay or you're straight, if you are especially a wanderer who has come here with a certain goal in mind of polarizing, if you're using sexual energy transfers and not using them to polarize, just like everything, Ross says, if you aren't choosing to polarize, you lose those opportunities to polarize. So AIDS then was set up as an opportunity to create more potential for polarization within this certain culture, because otherwise all that catalyst is just lost. And again, this isn't just a condition for homosexuals. This is a condition for anyone who is not using their catalyst, especially their sexual catalyst, to polarize. But heterosexuals always have that random potential for an offspring to sort of create an initiation and an opportunity for an entity to begin to choose to polarize. So AIDS then is that potential initiation for beings who want to polarize but have been a bit distracted from that path because of things that are pleasurable and addictive, because that is the way of humans. And so that's what the Confederation says about AIDS. Whether or not you want to believe that, that's up to you. I do, for the most part, for me, I take a lot of things that are consciously channeled with a giant grain of salt. I believe raw pretty wholeheartedly for the most part, but conscious channeled stuff can really be skewed by the person who's doing the channeling. But on some real primal level, this does kind of make sense. And if you can step out of any sort of social conditioning, social judgment we have against homosexuals for whatever reason, I don't think it's too problematic. I think if we project judgment, again, like this need for some kind of sexual purity, then it can become kind of problematic. But I think it really needs to be put into the context of the fact that everything that the Logos has done to design our creation is to encourage us to polarize. So when we are sidestepping opportunities for polarization over and over and over again, our catalyst is going to ramp up in a way to increase the opportunity for that choice, especially here in the end times of this cycle. We're at the very end of this cycle. Everyone who has incarnated has the opportunity to reach harvest. They're close enough vibrationally. They just have to make that last leap over that threshold, but it's easy to be distracted. But the Logos is still going to try over and over again to get our attention until eventually it starts to slow down those attempts. But for a while, it is going to try over and over to give us opportunities to serve so that we can become polarized and reach fourth density harvest. That is the goal of third density, of all of it. So ultimately, the things that have been chosen to propel that polarization may feel a little strange, send our hackles up in a way, but this is the context for all of it. The Logos wants us to polarize, to move beyond third density. Third density is such a temporary small part of the creation, meant to make us polarize, to make us choose which pathway we want to continue the rest of our evolution. And if we aren't making those choices, then our third density incarnation becomes kind of pointless, right? Like we talked about that before with the law of responsibility, that the lifespan gets shorter because we aren't dealing with our catalyst, we aren't using our catalyst to polarize, and we aren't putting our catalyst in the proper place, and we're just building up lots and lots of trauma that we're not dealing with. So our incarnation gets shortened so that we aren't dealing with too much. So in short, to wrap it back around, Ra says homosexuals have a great distortion in the area of bisexual reproduction. Obviously, they aren't attracted to their polarized body complex, so that they then have this random potential to create offspring, which is an important choice that the Logos has made for our evolution. And again, like, this isn't just a human condition. We've all seen incidences of homosexual animals. I had a pair of female pigeons who were very, very deeply bonded and mated and loved each other and tried to raise babies together, but they weren't able to cross that fertility threshold because they didn't have polarized body complexes. They both laid eggs. So it's not just part of the human condition. It is, in a lot of ways, a normal biological outcome. So we'll go forward and we'll keep trying to put this into context and talk about it. But yeah, I did write an article about this. Maybe you've read it. It's on my Substack about what Ross says about homosexuality. And I really think, in general, for the most part, they're talking about this impairment of the bisexual reproductive function. But again, Ross says that sixth density wanderers also refrain from programming that bisexual reproductive function. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people who are homosexual are wanderers, because wanderers have had many more biological incarnations. So it's possible that that building up of biological incarnations, that bias, is persistent through the densities. And then when we come to Earth, it's very confusing to maintain the opposing sexual potential when we're used to the other sexual potential. But I really do think that they're talking about the magnet is what's impaired. And I think they also say that sixth density wanderers don't utilize that magnet either. So I don't think that the magnet being impaired is some kind of moral failing by any means. Whether it causes a moral failing or is the effect of a moral failing, I don't think either of those things. I think it's just one way that we're experiencing our reality. And it's totally okay, because the Creator wants all potential experiences. But the Logos, our portion of the creation, has a specific set of parameters that it has chosen for experience to work within that will encourage the most polarity, and sometimes our choices distort the potentials that the Logos has put there for us. So, 31.9, Dawn asks, why does density of population create these confusions? I am Ra. The bisexual reproductive urge has as its goal not only the simple reproductive function, but more especially the desire to serve others being awakened by this activity. In an overcrowded situation where each mind-body-spirit complex is under a constant bombardment from other selves, it is understandable that those who are especially sensitive would not feel the desire to be of service to other selves. This also would increase the probability of a lack of desire or a blockage of the red ray reproductive energy. In an uncrowded atmosphere, this same entity would, through the stimulus of feeling the solitude about it, then have much more desire to seek out someone to whom it may be of service, thus regularizing the sexual reproductive function. So, I think this is really interesting. Obviously, this part does not just refer to homosexuals, but I do think it's interesting that Ross says that those who are especially sensitive fall into this category. So again, I personally believe that a lot of homosexuals are wanderers, and that's why it's a lot more confusing for them, but also why they just have a lot more freedom of self-expression. They don't feel so confined to the limitations of our third density reality and what we're supposed to be doing. But essentially here Ra's saying that, yeah, when you're in a crowded situation, you get fatigued. You get socially fatigued, right? You don't really want to spend a whole lot of time with other people. You have the feelings, like I said, a lack of desire, a blockage of red ray reproductive energy. When you look at how dense some areas are populated and how poorly we are utilizing resources and how wasteful we are and these kinds of things, begin to build up a blockage of a desire for red ray reproduction. So people stop wanting to have children. Whereas, if we go back, let's say 100 years into the past, maybe even a little bit more, and if the same person who's living in an apartment in New York City was living in a small village in who knows where, just in the middle of nowhere, very small village, a few hundred people, you're going to have different feelings in regards to the people around you, in regards to your social battery and how much energy you have and how much desire you have to interact with other people. Because it's very normal to want to interact with other people. That's biologically normal. But how we live in cities isn't really super biologically normal. It's not ideal. I know a lot of people love living in big cities, but as far as for our own energetic configuration, it's not the most ideal thing. The more we're around nature, the more our energy body relaxes and is able to allow things through it instead of blocking things from flowing through it. So someone who in 2026 is living in New York City and feels and is homosexual might have 100 years ago have sort of these same feelings, desires on some level, but they aren't as overwhelming to the point where it's impossible to seek out a heterosexual relationship, especially if that's your only opportunity. Because again, like if you live in a very small town a long time ago, finding another homosexual partner wasn't impossible, but it wasn't very likely. So if you wanted to have a life partner, or if you wanted to have children, you had to find a heterosexual partner, someone who was oppositely polarized biologically than you, to carry this out. And it would be more likely for you to feel compelled to do that than it is now. And again, when you have, it feels like you could choose from anybody. It feels like you could, at this point in time, we could become romantic partners with basically anyone on the planet, right? But again, 100 years ago, that was not the case. Your dating pool was tiny. Was very limited. And so you had to work within that if you didn't want to just be alone for the rest of your life. And again, too, if you live in like a small village, you're much more likely to feel like it's a reasonable choice to have children, or even a necessary choice to have children. You know, back then we needed more bodies to do labor so that we could eat. And so having kids to work on your farm, work on your homestead, these kinds of things were a necessary conclusion that one would come to when they're looking forward into their future and looking at the kind of life that they want to live. So again, I don't love these answers, this framing from Ra, but it does make sense on some level where we are, again, we're animals, we have biological needs and instincts. And sometimes those biological needs and instincts are thwarted by the social complex. So our orange ray desires get overrode by our yellow ray desires. And again, like I said, I don't think that this just applies to homosexuals. A lot of this that Ra's saying, but some of it is very specific to homosexuals. So 3110. Don says, roughly how many previous incarnations, shall we say, would a male entity in this incarnation have had in the past as a female to have a highly homosexual orientation in this incarnation? Just roughly. I am Ra. If an entity has had roughly 65% of its incarnations in the sexual/biological body complex, the opposite polarity to its present body complex, this entity is vulnerable to the aura infringement of your urban areas and may perhaps become of what you may call an homosexual nature. It is to be noted at this juncture that although it is much more difficult, it is possible in this type of association for an entity to be of great service to another in fidelity and sincere green ray love of a non-sexual nature thus adjusting or lessening the distortions of its sexual impairment. So I'm going to go ahead and read the next one before I start my comments. 3111, Dawn says, Timothy Leary, doing research, wrote that at the time of puberty and up through that time, there is an imprint occurring on the DNA coding of an entity, and that, for instance, sexual biases are imprinted due to early sexual experiences or some of the first sexual experiences of the entity. Does anything like this actually happen? I am Ra. This is partially correct. Due to the nature of solitary sexual experiences, it is in most cases unlikely that what you call masturbation has an imprinting effect upon later experiences. This is similarly true with some of the encounters which might be seen as homosexual among those of this age group. These are often, instead, innocent exercises in curiosity. However, it is quite accurate that the first experience in which the mind-body-spirit complex is intensely involved will indeed imprint upon the entity for that life experience a set of preferences. Okay, so I'm pretty sure we've talked about before that Dawn had a traumatic sexual experience during the time of puberty, which is why he's bringing up this question. It was his cousin, an older female cousin, tied him and another family member up, I believe, tied them together in a way that forced things to happen between the two of them. And so this actually did imprint upon Dawn a desire to tie his partner up. So when Carla and Dawn first got together, they did have a sexual relationship. However, it was contingent upon Carla letting Dawn tie her up. And this wasn't a huge problem for Carla, except that she has rheumatoid arthritis. So it was actually very painful for her to be restricted in this way. So eventually they just had to give it up because they didn't have congruent sexual desires. Dawn was not willing to let go of this desire. He wasn't that fond enough of sexual intercourse to be willing to do it without this preference. So I do think this question has to do with Dawn and himself. And I will also add here to please take everything I say after this with a big grain of salt, because this is my opinion. But I do think that some of the questioning about homosexuality may have also been Dawn asking about himself. Now, I know I'm not the only one who has come to this conclusion, reading some of the things that I've read about Dawn. But the fact is, in Tilting at Windmills, Carla says some things that are suspicious. And at one point, she even emphasizes very emphatically that Dawn was straight. Dawn was very straight. Oh yeah, Dawn was straight. But the fact that she even had to say that was interesting, because a lot of the things that she was saying would lead you to another conclusion. For instance, Dawn often told Carla how he wished she was a man. And he really just did not like women at all. He really didn't like anything feminine. He was very much loved everything masculine, loved being a man, doing boy things. When he was a teacher, a professor, it was at an engineering school, so all of his students were male. When he would do his channeling groups, because, he recruited his students to participate in these meditation/channeling experiments. So they were all men. Carla was an outlier because she was a girlfriend of one of his students at the time, and she was curious about the meditation aspect of what Dawn was doing and wanted to join the group because of that. Dawn loved to drink and would go out drinking with his male friends, and he would bring Carla with. However, he would make Carla wait in the car while he was drinking at the bar with his buddies. And at one point, one of his buddies saw Carla in the car waiting for Dawn to be done drinking and invited her in. And after that point, then Carla was allowed to come and drink with his buddies, but Don was just, he really didn't like, again, the things that Carla did that he saw as more feminine, like shopping was repulsive to him. One of Carla's hobbies was shopping. The fact that she wanted kids was absolutely abhorrent to him. He had really strong feelings because when he was a kid, he felt like his dad was just like a slave for the family, that his mom had the better end of the deal as far as staying home and taking care of the kids, and that his dad having to go to work was just like terrible. Don never wanted that for himself. He never wanted to be stuck having to financially care for a family, which is ironic because that's ultimately kind of what led to his downfall at the end here as we go on through the contact. Towards the end, Don had to find a new home for him and Carla and Jim to live into, and while it was a rather unconventional family, he was the breadwinner. And so having to sign a mortgage so that he would be financially responsible for his family was so hard for him to do because he had these biases from being a child that this was just like the worst possible thing that could happen to a man, being trapped, having to take care of a family. Like these were his beliefs. And again, I think that's one of the main reasons why Carla chose to get sterilized, was because she knew that Don probably would have left her if she had a baby, even if it was with someone else or whatever. My guess is Don wouldn't have wanted any part of that whatsoever. But those things, as well as some other things that Carla says, she does have to defend Don as being heterosexual. And I went and just checked what part it was of Tilting at Windmills where defends Don for being very straight as an arrow, she says. But she's talking about how he really was just kind of repulsed by sex. But in particular, she mentions how the mixing of male and female scents is what repulsed him, like scents, like S-E-N-T-S. And having to bathe afterwards was just felt like such a chore. He was just really turned off by the whole idea of, at least here in this context, heterosexual sex. But, it is possible that Don was just more asexual. But in a lot of ways, I wonder if Don had been born in modern times, if his preferences for men would have manifested in a different way. But even still, at this point in time, Don was very much, again, he told Carla all the time that he wished she was a man, and that's just a very interesting thing to say to your female partner if you are straight. Because again, Carla's like, Don was straight as an arrow. Well, I don't know. He wasn't actually attracted to women, so I don't know if he's actually straight. I don't know if that's what I would call him. Again, I think asexual might be a closer term to what Don was. Again, he was celibate. After the short sexual relationship between him and Carla, he was celibate, but yeah, I do have questions about how much of these questions that Don is asking are about himself, and even again, how much Ra's responses are in reference to Don's own feelings about his own quote-unquote sexual distortions. But to just go over here what Ra has said in these answers with less opinion and anecdotes about Don. It takes about 65%, so about 2/3 of your incarnations, if you have a preference to which physical body you prefer, if you have at least 2/3 in that body complex, and then you incarnate as the opposite of that body complex, and then you live in an area where you experience an infringement upon your aura, you might become homosexual. But then Ross says it is to be noted at this juncture that although it is much more difficult, it is possible in this type of association for an entity to be of great service to another in fidelity and sincere green ray love of a non-sexual nature, thus adjusting or lessening the distortions of its sexual impairment. This little response right from Ra, that's kind of, shoehorned in. Ra doesn't usually offer their opinion unless it's directly related to the question, and this isn't quite directly related. but I do think it could be taken as Ra talking to Dawn about his relationship with Carla, where it's a non-sexual relationship, but it's still another polarized body. It's still a woman that he can feel sincere green ray love towards, even if he hates women on the whole, which he really kind of did. So, lessening the distortions of its sexual impairment, hating one gender, I think, in and of itself could be considered a sexual impairment. That sort of rejection of one body complex, to me, that could, in and of itself, could be considered a sexual impairment. And like I've said, Dawn had that sexual impairment for sure. But then Dawn asks about whether or not your first sexual experiences imprint upon you, and Ross says that some first sexual experiences are very innocent, be it masturbation or just innocent exploration between two young beings who are kind of figuring this out, finding this part of their bodies, finding this function of their bodies out together. But the first, real sexual experience that you have does create an imprint upon you in some significant way. So, 3112, Dawn asks, does the Orion group use this, shall we say, as a gateway to impressing upon entities, shall we say, preferences which could create negative polarization? I am Ra. Just as we of the Confederation attempt to beam our love and light whenever given the opportunity, including sexual opportunities, so the Orion group will use an opportunity if it is negatively oriented or if the individual is negatively oriented. So I think this is a big answer from Ra, because again, this isn't just talking about sexual experiences. This is saying that the Confederation will attempt to beam love and light whenever given the opportunity, including sexual opportunities, and the Orion group will use any opportunity that is negatively oriented or if the individual is negatively oriented. So, in our busy universe, there are all sorts of entities watching for all sorts of opportunities to meddle, let's say, interfere. Obviously, the Confederation is beaming love and light in a way that we would desire interference, and Orion entities are going to use our distortions, our negatively oriented distortions, and intensify those if they are given the opportunity to do so. So I think it's always good to be aware of that potential. And I think that's why it's so important to know what's going on in your own mind, to do the balancing exercises, to explore our own mind, to meditate, so that we don't have subconscious thoughts that are being used against us, that the puppet strings are being pulled on these thoughts that we don't even know are really there, that we haven't really examined because we feel guilty or we feel dirty. Those are the opportunities that Orion can use to play up these feelings of, if we're talking about sexual stuff, then a lot of stuff that we consider taboo and problematic, and some stuff that is taboo and problematic. Some things aren't. Some things we consider, if it makes you feel guilty at all, though, an Orion being is going to pull those strings to try to intensify those negative feelings. But the Confederation is there as well, trying to beam love and light to positive situations or situations that have positive potential, including sexual situations. So, 3113, Dawn says, is there any emotional bias that has nothing to do with male-female sexual polarity that can create sexual energy buildup in an entity? I am Ra. The sexual energy buildup is extremely unlikely to occur without sexual bias upon the part of the entity. Perhaps we did not understand your question, but it seems obvious that it would take an entity with the potential for sexual activity to experience a sexual energy buildup. So, Ra didn't really understand Dawn's question here. Dawn's going to clarify and be more specific. 3114, Dawn says, I was thinking more of the possibility of the Orion group having influenced, say, certain members of the Third Reich who I have read reports of having sexual gratification from the observation of the, in some cases, the gassing and killing of entities in the gas chambers. I am Ra. We shall repeat, these entities had the potential for sexual energy buildup. The choice of stimulus is certainly the choice of the entity. In the case of which you speak, These entities were strongly polarized orange ray, thus finding the energy blockage of power over others, the putting to death being the ultimate power over others, this then being expressed in a sexual manner, though solitary. In this case, the desire would continue unabated and be virtually unquenchable. You will find, if you observe the entire spectrum of sexual practices among your peoples, that there are those who experience such gratification from domination over others, either from rape or from other means of domination. In each case, this is an example of energy blockage, which is sexual in its nature. So, I feel like this is a timely and relevant response from Ra, and question from Dawn, because we obviously are seeing the release of the horrors that are the Epstein files, which contain a lot of discussion of these types of sexual desires and sexual situations. And, here Ra is saying that killing somebody is the ultimate power over others. So when you are a negative being, you build up negative polarization, you build up negative desires. The apex of that desire is actually taking the life of another being. So some beings get sexual gratification from that. And that's pretty disturbing, but it's the way it is, and it's a function of the negative path. And Ross says that these desires will continue unabated and be virtually unquenchable. So it's just kind of like any addiction. You need to escalate things to continue to chase the high of the first time that something like this happens. But how do you escalate things beyond just killing somebody? There isn't much further to go beyond that. So your desires become unquenchable because, again, there's no further escalation, but you're still going to keep doing it because you're going to try to get as close as possible. So again, there is the two levels to this. There are those who are just actually have the feeling of getting off on this type of power over others. And then there are those who consciously recognize the metaphysical power that is generated from engaging in these situations of power over others. And again, this is how a negative entity would use sexual energy transfers to polarize and find the gateway to intelligent infinity, is by escalating these orange and yellow ray distortions of power over others. So 31.15, Dawn says, would the Orion group then be able, shall we say, to impress on entities this orange ray effect, or did they? Is this the way that this came about, is what I'm trying to get at. Is this the way that these concepts came about on this planet? Because if we go back to the beginning of third density, there must be a primal cause of this. I am Ra. The cause of this is not Orion. It is the free choice of your peoples. This is somewhat difficult to explain. We shall attempt. The sexual energy transfers and blockages are more a manifestation or example of that which is more fundamental than the other way about. Therefore, as your peoples became open to the concepts of bellicosity and the greed of ownership, these various distortions then began to filter down through the tree of mind into body complex expressions, the sexual expression being basic to that complex. Thus, these sexual energy blockages, though Orion influenced and intensified, are basically the product of the beingness chosen freely by your peoples. This will be the final question, unless we may speak further upon this question to clarify or answer any short queries before we close. So here, Dawn is asking, okay, so did these terrible manifestations of sexual desire, is this something that Orion created in our peoples? And Ross says no. It's something your peoples created within themselves based upon the bellicosity and the greed of ownership. And so, Ross says that orange and yellow ray distortions are about desire to possess or desire to be possessed. I think more often than not, this is driven by the desire of those who desire to possess, because they'll go out of their way to find those who they can then possess. But Orion is intensifying these opportunities, but Orion did not seed our social memory complex with these opportunities necessarily. So that's interesting too, because Ra does say that Orion will disseminate their philosophy to those who are seeking that philosophy. But again, Orion didn't start interacting with us really directly until pretty recent times. So we already had to have these types of sexual distortions before Orion ever transmitted the means of using these sexual distortions as in a ritualistic way. But they have. Like, there's no doubt in my mind about that at this point, that is part of the dissemination of Orion philosophy, is creating opportunities for this to come about and increasing the efficiency of how this is done. So, 3116, Don says, I just need to know if this then works through the racial memory to infect the entire population in some way. Does that sort of thing happen? I am Ra. The racial memory contains all that has been experienced. Thus, there is some, shall we say, contamination even of the sexual. This showing mostly in your own culture as the various predispositions to adversary relationships, or as you call them, marriages, rather than the free giving one to another in the love and the light of the infinite Creator. So, this is a hot take from Ra, calling marriages adversary relationships, at least in our culture. But I think what Ra is saying here is that the way we view marriages has a lot to do with greed of ownership, as Ra refers to it in the previous question. We see marriages as a contract. We see our marriage partner as belonging to us. We see their property as belonging to us. And often, for a long time, that was what motivated a lot of marriages, was this acquisition of property, of power, of resources, even if those resources were more human bodies because you needed children to labor in the fields. Marriages are seen, again, like I said, as a contract, as a business arrangement in a lot of ways. And even to this day, I think there are people who would sneer at the idea of marrying for love, marrying just for love, because there are so many other financial reasons to marry that are seen as even more important and relevant than the idea of love. So obviously not all marriages are adversary relationships, but we do have this lens through which we see marriage as a contractual business agreement, even more so than we see marriage as an opportunity to, as Ra says, give love freely to one another. All right, so last question. Don says, that was precisely the point I was trying to make. Thank you very much. Not to tire the instrument, I will just ask then if there's anything we can do to make the instrument more comfortable or to improve the contact. I am Ra. Please be aware that this instrument is somewhat fatigued. The channel is very clear. However, we find the vital energy low. We do not wish to deplete the instrument. However, there is a, shall we say, energy exchange which we feel an honor duty to offer when this instrument opens itself. Therefore, counsel we this instrument to attempt to assess the vital energies carefully before offering itself as an open channel. All is well, you are conscientious. I am Ra. I leave this instrument and you in the love and in the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth then rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai. So here, Ra is saying that Carla had a little too low of vital energy to really she should not have done this session. It used up too much of her vital energy. But I think we've already talked about this a little bit before. I don't think Ra has explicitly explained it, but they will at some point, that when Carla goes into trance, she has already given Ra her energy. And so it would be a waste if they were to come in and say, oh, she's too tired, we need to leave her right now, because the energy is already spent. So they are going to use that energy that's already been spent because she's given it to them, and that's the most logical thing to do. Even if ultimately on the back end it's harmful for her, it's going to be harmful for her regardless of if Ra uses that energy or lets that energy go to waste. So they're going to use the energy out of respect for Carla giving them that energy. However, they want Carla to have a little bit more awareness of her own personal energies, of her own vital energy levels, before she agrees to go into trance and channel them. And this is something that, going forward, is part of the maintenance of the instrument, is this constant evaluation and assessment of her vital energies and whether or not it's a good idea to channel Ra, or if it's going to deplete her in a significant way. All right, so that is session 31. Again, one of the most challenging sessions in the Ra material because of the language that Ra uses in describing homosexual orientation, but I do believe in full context, what Ra is saying isn't problematic or judgmental. I think a lot of what we see as problematic or feel as judgmental is a projection of our own societal distortions and expectations and beliefs in regards to homosexuality. But again, I will emphasize that my holistic understanding, including some of the stuff I've read from Quo and Latwii, is that I think a lot of homosexuals are wanderers. And so it's really hard to say that there's, again, some sort of core moral failing in not wanting to have sex with the body complex that's oppositely polarized yours. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's only wrong in the sense that the Logos created this potential magnetic pole to draw two entities together, and homosexuals aren't engaging in that. But like I've said, sixth density wanderers usually aren't engaging in that either. So I don't think that there is actually any sort of negative judgment from Ra, but if you are a queer person, I can understand how it comes off that way, because that's sort of one of the main hallmarks of religion, is to reject homosexuality and to judge it as against nature. Because I mean, in one core fundamental way, it is, but essentially if you aren't just having like indiscriminate sexual energy transfers with everyone you feel even the slightest sexual pull towards, that is a distortion of nature, right, in that context. So, and I don't think most religions like the other end of that spectrum, right? I don't think that they would agree that the other end of that spectrum is actually what is quote unquote natural, but it is. But then on the other hand too, Ra does say that monogamy is how they usually experience relationships in higher densities. So it really is this paradox, and it really is just a potential spectrum of experience for the creator to experience itself. And as long as you aren't hurting anybody, as long as you aren't manipulating or lying or seeing others as a means to your own ends, then everything else is just details. Okay, whether you're in the sinkhole and choosing not to polarize, or you're doing your best to polarize positively, I don't think your sexual preferences are an important part of your polarity in any way whatsoever. So I just want to be clear about that. And again, too, in the modern times, even far more than 45 years ago, in the modern times, it's very common for homosexuals to get married, to have kids, to continue this quote-unquote normal, expected unfolding of potential avenues of service to others that the Logos wants us to experience. So, I don't think there's any problem with homosexuality. I don't think Ra is actually saying that there is a problem with homosexuality, other than it's a distortion of the bisexual reproductive function that works like a magnet without an act of will to bring two people together. That's all. I hope that makes sense. If anyone has any questions, or again, comments, especially comments from queer people, I'd love to hear, just from your own perspective, how this all lands and how it makes you feel, how the things I've said make you feel. If anything I've said is problematic, anything I've said personally is problematic, or if any of my interpretations of Ra are problematic, I'm open to hearing all that, because I think it's good to just refine these ideas and concepts, because this session is a little bit of a mess, let's say. There's a lot of heavy things to think about and put into context. So I don't mind keeping that conversation ongoing. I appreciate you all for sticking with me through this one, and I'm grateful to our Creator for giving us all experiences and allowing all things to be proper in their place. And I'm grateful to you all, and I look forward to session 32. See you next time.